Okay, hi everyone. Good morning from London. I know some of you are calling in from the US and other parts of the world. I know one of our co-chair actually is in Phoenix, so it's it's a bit late for her. She'll be up the whole night basically. So welcome to this session, which is called Securing the Future. And I'm glad to have Roz, Sarah, and Simon with me. And I'm not going to take too much, time away from them because we have a lot of interesting talks coming your way. So I guess we're just going to get started. I'm not going to introduce them because they will be introducing themselves, from their talk. So over to you, folks.
Wonderful. Should we introduce ourselves first, or just introduce yourself and go straight into the presentation?
Yeah, just make it part of your presentation.
Of course. Good morning, all. Let me get my slides up. Just to confirm that is coming across. That'd be great. Yes. My slide's clear. Wonderful. Good morning, all, one and all. Well, it's always going to be a tough one to follow Simon directly. I'm the other Simon, the much less important one. So good morning, I'm Simon Clifford. I have been working in public protection, in policing, particularly over the last 5 years. And thusly, quite a lot of my area of focus is going to be biasing around that. I hope people find this session really interesting. I've been working with Roz and Sarah in terms of pulling together a unified presentation that talks to the same area of activity underpinning securing our future, but with some practical applications around that. And particularly we're talking to the use case of video and AI, which I know I've been looking at extensively for the last couple of years, and on speaking to others in every sector, private, public, and the third sector. I know there's intense activity around this across the piece. So we're going to describe this. I've got the opener to try and describe how this would look from a particular strategic perspective, which is kind of my core area, that C-suite conversation as to the whys and the wherefores of all this, and certainly from my perspective, how mapping has been so helpful in my role and roles working in public protection, law enforcement, etc. But equally, that will be passing the baton on to Roz and Sarah, who will talk about the people that actually do the do in terms of how this goes into operations and some wider sort of security considerations and ethical pieces. So I'm the opener just to warm you up. The real quality is coming later. So the drive to innovation. We're all on this relentless drive to innovation, and certainly within this context, there is a constant push, whichever sector you're in. I talk about private, public, and third sector, whether it's for profit in the private sector, or for efficiency and effectiveness, value for money with the public purse for the public sector, and wider doing more good in the third sector. We're all looking to drive down waste and cost. Bottom line, it creates impact. I'll put that on quiet, forgive me. Schoolboy errands, first thing in the morning. But why do we do this? Well, ultimately, it's driving the pace of our organization. It's driving our competitive edge. We want to drive better services, bringing down our costs, increase customer satisfaction. So that's the why holistically, but actually from an individual perspective, if you are like me, literally my job is to drive transformation. So actually, how do we, from a human perspective, advance in our lives and our careers, in our sense of worth? Well, actually, it's about being good at our job and moving that forward. And I highlight that because ultimately we're all siloed to one degree or another, and actually only communication can help us transcend that. So there's a market dynamic need to do this. There's a competitive advantage. There's a continuous striving to drive down the cost of doing business. So as I identified, the areas we're looking at are employment and an insurance claim within the context of using video. Video has been a massive, is driving massive change within society, whether children watching TikToks, the movement to YouTube and Amazon Prime and streaming services. Video has changed all of our lives and all of our habits, and increasingly a lot of homegrown video, whether it's on smartphone, CCTV, dash cam, that is prevalent, and actually managing millions, billions of hours of video to derive real value is a major challenge. And ultimately, when we're looking at securing our future, how we work together as these different cohorts, these different sectors, I think is going to be really meaningful and important. And ultimately, one of the major challenges that we face is what I call the cost of the narrow view. There was a report that came out by UK government in the summer talking about the overhead of our technology estate across government, which is estimated to be up to £22 billion worth of technical debt, which is at least 50%. KTLO, a new acronym for you on this morning, which is keeping the lights on, which is basically every time a patch goes out, something breaks, and there's a whole bunch of tasking to fix it again, to remediate the problem that new security patch has fixed. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You can't not deploy the security patch, but you don't know what's going to break when you do. And when you have hundreds of systems, it's virtually impossible to completely test that all day long. Clearly, cloud is part of the solution to that, but it's no Shangri-La either. We need to have a joined up system. And increasingly, that's part of the challenge of working in one organization. I can think of one database in government that has over 300 users across government and the private sector. The knock-on impact, we can't know everything in those systems. And one of the wider challenges that really goes to some of those core missions around the environment and actually delivering public services with the challenges of migration, of climate change, etc., is all the time we're spending keeping the lights on, just keeping what already worked working. We're not actually solving some of the bigger problems. And actually, this goes to the climate crisis that Simon referenced in his introductory talk. This is the overarching imperative. I know we've all had our minds very deep in COVID thing, but that is a transitionary thing, as significant and globally impactful and unprecedented as it was. Ultimately, we're getting ahead of that now. Different countries at different speeds, but at some point, the worst of it will be behind us. Hopefully, that is now. But certainly it should be getting better over time. But the climate situation, actually, we still have a lot to do. And why do I reference that when I'm talking about technology? Well, ultimately, 1% of global power consumption is in data centers. So actually, the burden is on us to actually drive really good and efficient technology. Deduplication is one of the big areas that I talk about and have been looking at in public sector, whether within separate silos within one organization, say a police force, one department may not know the advanced technologies being rolled out in another department, but certainly when you look across multiple forces, multiple remote services, multiple arms of government, there's a great lack of detail in terms of some of the technologies that are available, partly by virtue of the incredible complexity, the number of systems there are, and actually that pace, that relentless pace of driving out new cool innovation to particular service areas. Government is a big old beast, but it's not as big as government, society, and the third sector put together. And that's where mapping as a shorthand is incredibly valuable. So talking into these use cases, fundamentally, I'm a strategist, I boil everything down. It's really about a request or a report. And when we're talking about the recruitment side of things, it's applying for a job, whether that's as an external candidate or even an internal candidate looking for a transfer. And certainly large-scale organizations that might be certainly multi-regional, they might be multinational, doing an internal transfer. But even if you're an external applicant, a lot of recruitment is driven by LinkedIn these days. And I know how little money can go a long way in terms of the amount of recruits you have, and then the burden of doing the sift. And do you hire an external agency to do that, or actually do you want to give it quality, etc.? Clearly, there's a massive interest in driving efficiency in that, because actually, in some cases, and certainly in a number of roles, you want to draw out the outliers, but equally, you don't want to have an endless pit of money going into the sift part of the recruitment process. So again, that imperative of, you want to do the best you can, but within affordable constraints, whether it be time or money. And clearly, there's a real interest in using automations and AI in this space. And certainly some of the organizations I've seen now, much more hip and modern, startup-y kind of organizations than public sector. But I think this will be more widely adopted, is where the streamlined nature of being able to apply for an application, being saying, just give us your name, your LinkedIn profile, and a groovy, funky video saying, oh, you're the guy for us or the girl for us. And that sounds really cool, and that's really very, very helpful for digital natives that are very familiar with cameras. So selfie, hi, I'm Simon Clifford, I'm going to be awesome at this job, and here's my LinkedIn. Easy. Submits it in a couple of minutes. But if you're from the organization side, what do you do about that? And we'll go back into that in a bit more detail in a moment with a map. And then talking about claims, and this might be thinking very, very different, right? Whether you want to report an accident or even a crime that you filmed on a smart camera or on a personally owned CCTV system at your house, somebody stole your car or tried to break into your car, etc., how that might be submitted. So two very different use cases, request, report, but actually underpinned by some very common technology. So again, to talk a little bit more about the detail, a candidate, rapid, low-cost sift, that's good. Personalizing friendly persona, it's creating a view of the organization that is recruiting as conscious of the candidate's time, respectful of that time. So that's should be a plus to the candidate. Maximizing return on investment. Ultimately, we spend X on doing a recruitment. We want to get the biggest draw of talent possible, so we want to make the process streamlined. And then actually, what most candidates might not perceive is actually the minute we are allowing somebody to, or requesting somebody upload a video or making an option to them, what else can we derive from that video that actually you probably wouldn't pick up from the CV or the LinkedIn profile? And for those that have been looking at this AI, sentiment analysis, markers about honesty, good communication styling, tonality, all of these things can be lifted very, very quickly. Whether there's the right quality is for my colleagues to discuss about, but honesty, sincerity, quality of communication, and also these technologies scale. The bigger your organization, the bigger the ROI. Ultimately, they're multilingual by default because AI is. Forgive me, sun's just rising in Northampton. So an insurance claim. Seemingly very different, but ultimately dashcam CCTV as described. This could be for your own personal claim on an insurance because you just want to push that through so you get your claim paid back quite quickly. But actually, if you look at this as I have, in terms from a mapping context, you start to think and you consider the natural evolution of these things. So first pass, it could just be this is an easy way to upload an insurance claim. Certainly, it's an area where we're increasingly reaching out to the public from a law enforcement perspective. If you're a witness to some violence or an accident, dash cam evidence, and that's being submitted. But some people that upload this aren't particularly technical savvy, so they upload the whole file. Might be like 30 minutes of video that has to be manually reviewed. There's a massive driver to say, well, can we concatenate the time to review that evidence to see if it's sufficiently evidential? And absolutely, just saying, here's a picture of the accident to the police when we're logging 1,000 accidents over whatever period of time, we need to reconcile it with the right accident, because virtually all cars are grey, black and silver these days. So that doesn't help. So you need to identify it. Reducing liability, so from the private sector, not to be solely talking about emergency services, clearly an insurance company has an overarching requirement to try and show that its insured party is not liable wherever possible. So it's massively incentivized to capture evidence that supports that. But ultimately, we could see, as we've seen in certain previous insurance approaches, the introduction of insurance benefits to people having road sensing devices in the head. So for young drivers, that they're not speeding, they're not accelerating too quickly, etc., etc. You can see this naturally extend into the use of video. Increasingly, cars have cameras built in. Certainly, Tesla's got half a dozen. I think the Tesla truck's going to have a dozen. It's not a big reach to actually make it an option going straight into the operating system of a car to actually just say report that crime, or actually just saying as long as you turn that option on, that could be auto-submitted. It's a leap from where we are today. Technically, it's not hard. It's not hard to do. And actually, there was an interesting statistics that I don't have to hand, but it was even of the cohort of the public that are really passionate about their privacy, about 50% of them will flip that privacy concern for a minor convenience benefit. Add a financial benefit, it's probably take it up to 80–90%. So you might be a massive privacy advocate, so we'll give you £5 off your next visit to the supermarket, and suddenly say, wow, have all the data. We see that with kind of I'll call it, Tesco Club Card points. It's a classic example. What can be derived out of Tesco? For those not familiar, it's a large supermarket chain in the UK. The customer service kind of value piece is, I know for a fact that the amount of alcohol you consume in a week is considered if you reach out for their insurance. So if you're looking to get Tesco car insurance, I've heard in passing, the amount of alcohol you drink might actually affect that premium. So ultimately, you might give that up for £2 off your petrol fill up a week. So that's the point. We talk privacy, but actually benefits the wider piece. And this is where it comes together. So we've got two use cases, very different, but equally the same. The essential characteristics from my level, when I'm talking into sort of C-suite in terms of how this would get signed off, it was saying it's quite simple, really. Customer service goes up. It's improved. People will be happier. They will prefer our service. They will see improvement. We will bring costs down because we'll use an AI layer to help this done and help this being done, which is cheaper than people. Absolutely, it is. Of course, it is, and it scales. So the long tail of this is significant. Because we're using automated processing, the backlog disappears, evaporates overnight, and equally the processing time reduced from hours, days, or weeks to seconds or milliseconds, which again, benefit. And ultimately, that all drives up profit. It drives up value for money. That is literally our sworn purpose in public sector, and it's our core purpose in industry. And actually, increasingly now, because of the maturity of services from the major cloud providers and others, these are commodity components. So the actual user example where I'm talking about, we're going to have a fantastic new insurance product that will give you maybe 50% cheaper as long as you give us all this data, or 20% cheaper, but we're making that back in spades in terms of reduced liability, etc. And that's the innovation. The technology components underpinning it are commodity now. So actually, from a project risk perspective, I'm using a series of commodity tools connected in an elegant and innovative way. That's very low cost from a delivery perspective at C-suite level. And I'm sure Ros will maybe consider a little of that. So a map. This wouldn't be Map Camp without a map. Here's a map of both processes, and the only difference is one is accident report, the other one is job application, and ultimately taking you through the steps. Those more familiar can read it, but I'll just guide you through. So it's starting off with the user. they have a requirement to have an accident report or a job application. And the job application is slightly more bespoke. Accident report is pretty much more standard, but again, that's in the product category, and they're going to do that via a website. How they're going to do that, how they're going to be led to that, via the process. We're skipping that stage of applying or engaging. So the website is going to request two things. One, who are you? Simon Clifford. And can you upload your video? Yes, please. So personal details for those that are covered by GDPR, we need to consider the GDPR consideration. And that is going to be captured on a hosting platform that's going to be on cloud compute. The video piece, the secret sauce, that's going to be very much a custom built component these days. And actually what it's looking to do is identify key characteristics. You know, the key metadata as to what I'm saying, the nature of the tonality and of how I present the video. It's also going to identify I'm a male and white and middle-aged and overweight and many other things combined. So ultimately, that's not in your CV. That absolutely is in your video, and that metadata is the secret sauce in terms of what makes this more powerful. It's going to be quicker, it's going to be cheaper, and we're going to drive insights that skip a whole raft of activity in terms of conventional route. It's equally true for the accident report or CCTV camera of a burglary. It's going to identify the perpetrator, it's going to identify the license plate, it's going to identify blame very, very quickly and make a recommendation. Ultimately, in most of these cases, a human is making the final decision, but heavily influenced by the data that's presented to them in black and white form. And therein lies some of the rub in terms of, as long as it's accurate. I won't steal the thunder of my colleagues. The enabling technology component piece, obviously, again, that is the great bit, which is a range of composite. I'm just checking time. Composite AIs. So in terms of least mature to most mature, voice to text, you know, we've all got intelligent speakers, or a number of us do. We can talk to our phones. That is mature, not huge amounts of risk in that, I would argue. Object recognition, something I've done a lot of work around, whether you're talking faces, guns, etc., within a law enforcement context, but equally license plate, cars, descriptions of objects, brands, etc. And the service offer that either organization is doing is highlighted in blue here. Identifying the key characteristics, metadata, etc. And then there's a wider consideration as well, which is that of legislation. Almost done. So where does this take us? Well, look, actually, smartphones are our ever-present digital persona, and they represent our identity. So this video is not only going to share a lot more information than probably the lay user would recognize, linked to our profile data linked to our mobile phone. That's going to provide even more detail, which maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A session if people have questions about. And certainly there's an underlying demand to have increased data accuracy. I'm going to get a new smartwatch, and the latest one I'm looking at has it can handle 5 different geolocation satellite systems. It's going to get more accurate. That's really, really valuable, increasingly what we do with it. And just a wider context, and again, this is a bit of a leap, but the understanding of how much DNA is being shared on ancestry websites and law enforcement use of this in terms of linking it to crimes. Something I only learned quite recently is how how linked we all are genetically in terms of, I think it's like third cousins. So ultimately, you only need about 2% of the population to be accessible via a DNA database. And again, that's that further connection. At the moment, we talk about the video, that's linked to a smartphone identity. Potentially down the line, this could be linked to a genetic identity. It can start to sound very dystopian. But actually, I'm an optimist, and I do think there is a join up in terms of how we secure our future. I think we need to have a more mature perspective in terms of data sharing between the major components of society. And I think if we are going to secure our future, we have to do it together. And part of that is is about having an understanding what our roles are and what we're doing. I think there's a lot of stage gating in terms of how information is shared, but absolutely more sharing should happen, but within a transparent, contextualized way. Private sector have a massive part to play in this, but equally government control a lot of things. So it needs to be in partnership, and this is where I've been on a journey with mapping in public sector, where I've been using it for very senior stakeholders that don't understand the technology, but do understand strategy and steps to achieve certain outcomes. And within that context, it's exactly this. It's look, fundamentally, it's about better understanding risk reward, getting rid of the clutter. I use it for technology, process, ethics, legislation, with the combined views. Certainly coordinating between C-suite, finance, technology, and users can all read off of a single map. And hopefully today's presentation will talk about how 3 different perspectives can be talking from a common purpose. Coordinating those stakeholders, identifying bottlenecks is key, that clear inertia from one phase to another, and then actually considering the piece moving forward. I've certainly done some stuff in terms of trying to put myself in the shoes of a criminal, in terms of saying, well, how would I innovate as a criminal in terms of how I would get past this? Because ultimately in policing, we lock people up and then stick them in a box for a few years to figure out how not to get caught next time. So ultimately, sometimes we have to project ourselves in terms of how they will innovate to continue to be criminals. And that's my bit done. Look forward to some interesting questions later. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you for that, Simon. So as Simon mentioned, there'll be a Q&A at the end. So if you can type your questions in the Q&A section here on Zoom, not on chat, that'll be great. So we'll pick them up at the end. I actually forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jen Ashley, and I've been co-chairing this conference for 5 years now, but I'm not going to take too much away from Ross's time. So over to you, Ross.
Hi, I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Ross Shaw. I've been in technology now for about 25 years, mainly in the automotive and a bit of financial sector, and I'm head of delivery at We Buy Any Car. None of these things that I'll talk about are things that we're going to do at We Buy Any Car. It's a representation of what we might discuss in the private sector. When we're taking some of these ideas and seeing how they actually kind of move forward and how we're going to get them through to delivery and actually make them happen. So I think, as Simon said, we've got 2 opportunities here. One is around the HR videos themselves, where obviously someone's going to come in with that nice elevator sales pitch and say, great, okay, opportunity for you. We can improve that CV sift. We can make sure that our candidates don't actually have to travel to you, so that it's more convenient for them. We'll get more candidates through the system. It will take less time. It will be automated. So we're going to start removing some of that unconscious bias. Some of these things are going to be really, really important to us in the actual roles that we're trying to recruit. So it might be that the roles are kind of scarce and that you've got to recruit all across the country because there's only a few people that are really kind of thought leaders in that area. And our AI integration is going to really help us hire the right people for the job profile that these companies have put forward. Similarly, the insurance claim, as Simon said, this is going to give us some really, really good ideas of what the actual accident is, how accurate the damage is around this vehicle. We're going to get a lot of the metadata that's already in the submission from our unfortunate person that's going to have to do the insurance claim. We're going to see what their location is for a start, with the geotagging that's associated with the video feed and the picture. We're going to be able to see the weather conditions. Was there anything else that was contributing to that accident? Lots and lots of things that you wouldn't necessarily get from a handwritten witness report. It's going to enable us to potentially identify further witnesses so that we can start saying, hey, did you see the guy in the red car? Improve those claim handling times so that we can potentially automatically pay out on an insurance claim where we can definitely see it's a no fault, I've driven into a wall, just pay out because it's a comprehensive insurance type claim. And our AI integration, our unique selling point for this software, is hopefully going to enable us to work out which claims are genuine, identify potential fraud, get things through the system faster, make our handlers' lives easier. You can just imagine the kind of sales pitch that's coming from our marketing comms team. And they've said, great, there's a massive opportunity here. We've spoken to quite a few people and they've said there's a need for this, there's a genuine need in the market. Create as a solution. So one of our first things that we just got to actually consider, just at a very high level, is keeping our users secure. There's legislation in place, GDPR, for our right to be forgotten. But we also have a need to retain some of that data. So in the case of where we might have employed the actual person that came through to interview, in order to save for any future prosecution against contractual issues, it might be that we've got to retain some of that data for 6 years because we did actually employ them. Similarly, if there has been a claim and there's some criminal opportunities, or so there's been some crime committed, we may still actually have to retain that data for a lot longer as well, so that we can actually just make sure that that claim might not reach the courts for several years, and we've got the video evidence that's going to help get the right outcome for our clients. You've also got the fact that somebody out there is just using their mobile phone to say, God, I've just been in an accident, let me upload this. And what you're actually getting is a little video of their kid eating breakfast this morning. And it's like, oh my Lord, let me change that video and please remove the one that's already there. We're going to have to be really, really clear what the purpose is for this video, just to make sure that people understand that this video will be used in the process of this claim, and that might involve us having to share these videos with external agencies. There's a good chance that we're going to have to share this with law enforcement agencies. We're going to have to share it with the opposing insurance company, so that we can say this is the evidence that we've got, this is a no-fault claim on behalf of our client. That data may be shared. Similarly, we're going to hold the metadata for that particular piece, and we've got a decision as a company to decide whether we just share the raw footage, maybe with the police, to say this is the accident that's occurred, or whether we also are going to end up sharing our metadata, which may include some of our AI tags to start saying, this looks like an honest person giving the witness account, and you know, these are the weather conditions at the time, etc. We've also got to just keep in mind who can view this video. So we're going to have to put in place moderators, the people who might be either doing the CV sift or people who are actually examining some of the accidents and being able to say, yeah, it's a genuine claim or not. And we're going to have to answer the question of, where is my data? Where's my data being held? I've got considerations for the actual solution itself. So technically, I'm going to have some like headliners. I'm going to give you something that is cyber secure yet easy to use. If I'm integrating into a system like LinkedIn, or I'm integrating into a system that already exists for our insurers, there's a good chance that all you've got to do to log in today is to give a Facebook click or a Google Hangouts click, or put in a simple email and password. May want, because this is more actually sensitive data, to put in some two-factor authentication, for example, so that we really are protecting the data at the end. We've got some technical business decisions to make around our solution being scalable, secure, optimizing the cost for our company, because we aren't a third sector charity, not-for-profit organisation. We've got a profit at the end of the day to make here. So we've got to try and actually come up with something that's cost effective and reliable, and that we can also support as a company. And in our vendor selection, when we move into the map, which is identical to the one that Simon shared previously, I'm going to choose where my database is and where the cloud compute is. For those particular pieces, I'm going to look at some of the latest legislation in GDPR, or what's coming up with the sort of Schrems too, and actually just work out, where's this data being held? What do I know about the company that is in my vendor selection? Is my company saying I'm only going to work with people who are actively reducing their carbon footprint and green suppliers only? There's a whole load of options when we're considering who to actually just sign a contract with and get compliance involved into the legal journey that we're going to have to go through, contract review and everything over who we actually choose to keep our data with and who can actually help us process some of this AI. And then we've got long-term storage considerations. So as I said, if there's a piece here that has got some legal implications, we can't necessarily release that data because we've got to hold it for legal reasons, 6 years for employment law in the UK. That's if it's a successful hire and there could be a contractual claim against it. Or with the car insurance claims, as I say, it could go on through the courts for a while. And are we keeping just the metadata, or are we actually storing the raw data footage itself in an unprocessed manner? Because that might be the piece that we need in 7 years' time. We can't necessarily predict what's going to be important to us. And also, when we passed it to a third party and someone said to us, right, okay, delete it, how confident are we that that is actually deleted off their systems and it's not actually just hanging around in some kind of backup somewhere? So looking at the map, from this private sector of the company, I'm expecting that I'm actually working on this area of uploading the video, the personal details, the key characteristics and the metadata that we're going to be storing for these two stories, the HR piece and the car insurance piece. And I will actually go back to the map, so just excuse me a second. The identifying key characteristics piece is in our Genesis phase. And if I take an example of the video in the custom built phase, then in these kind of areas, the identifying the key characteristics. Because we are definitely in this Genesis phase, it's going to be very experimental. We've got to identify what does an honest person look like. A lot of these technologies are not yet fully formed. I'll go back to, I think it's about 2018, Amazon in their early days stopped using some interview recruitment software that they were creating because it had a gender bias. It definitely didn't like females and it didn't like women who were talking about being part of the women's chess club. And they chose not to use that. Things have come a long way and the technologies have developed since then. But I would imagine in the company that I've got that is going to develop this solution, I've not got the scale and the number of developers that a big corporate like Amazon, Google, Facebook have got. I'm going to have to go through quite a few phases of looking at videos and assessing whether those ones are genuine claims or not genuine claims, fraudulent, to be able to tell the model to learn that this is actually an example of a bad interview or an example of a fraudulent claim. I've got to keep going through a feedback loop here, and this is going to be a very, very costly phase. And I've said in my solution design that the team competency is initially low. It's an innovative area. But there's a good chance that my software engineers haven't dealt with some of these technologies before. They're learning too. They will learn initially through mistakes, and we don't necessarily want those to happen with the people that we're partnering with. So we're going to have to go through some phases that are very much exploratory to see what a production-ready solution would look like for this. If I'm looking at the custom built phase, uploading a video, that one I'm probably a lot more confident about. I've still got probably some problems where my team might just be going to use some open source code or go to Stack Overflow as kind of like the answers over how am I going to actually just do this and achieve it and get up to speed. But they're going to get up to speed a bit more quickly than an area and a domain that they're just not familiar with. And hopefully I should be able to get it out in a kind of iterative manner, be able to keep developing on those stories and get something out as a solution to market a little bit quicker. But then I'm going to be, I'll say, in contrast to Simon's optimist, I'm going to do a bit more of a pre-mortem and say what could horribly go wrong for our company, for our brand. We're going to do some potential brand damage if we get a data breach. That's just a given. If we do get this data breach, I'm expecting to end up all over the press. My stakeholders, if I've got a listing with the US share market, then the SEC is going to have to be notified of that data breach. And if any of my directors are trading shares at that point in time, then they could be jailed for a bit of insider trading because they'd know about the breach way before all the different stakeholders and the shareholders would. I've got a risk that the AI doesn't have the intended outcome. So as with Amazon, they suddenly started recruiting a lot of male hires because of the bias that the AI had developed towards to women. You've got to be able to recognise that and be able to actually just put those stops in place if that happens. We've still got a massive problem here that we might not be first to market. We are a private sector company and we want to make as much profit as we can do. And part of that will be grabbing market share as we just get this launched. And we might not be profitable with this idea. In the early days, I'm going to have to set some confidence thresholds over how much I trust this AI process data. The early days, I'm definitely going to be doing a lot more manual verification of the model and trying to train the model up. And that might involve an awful lot more pairs of eyes on the video feeds than we would normally get. I've got ethical risks to consider around privacy, data protection and intended use. Today, I could start my company doing a screening of developers that have got SQL skills. 2 years down the line, I might be saying only hire developers that have got SQL skills because they've got like 100% hire rate. I've got to be very, very sure that I'm matching something with the profile and that this is actually just modifying in the future. Our self-regulation isn't up to scratch, so we let it fall by the wayside in about sort of 12 months' time, or we stop thinking that we've actually got to invest time on something as this is keeping the lights on, business as usual, and just start running off with our next great ideas of hooking up to the Tesla and understanding what happened with all the actual data from that Tesla. It's a new story that we're trying to move on, and also very, very public in the press at the moment. There's a good chance that we might have been hacked. It's not necessarily data to breach where we could have accidentally exposed it, left the documents in a bus stop or anything. There's a lot of people out there with malintent who might want to actually just hold us to ransom, hackers, just and basically use our data for other means, and then we've definitely lost the trust in our customer base. Governance, we've got learning that's going to be based on this implementation, and we also need to be able to handle those exceptions that are flagged by the system where it says, I just don't know whether this person's going to be a good hire or whether this is a genuine accident or not. We've got to review our compliance processes and see if they need updating. So it could be that legislation changes for GDPR, something else in the future that might be coming up. And we've now just got to actually just say, right, okay, have we got to change some of the way that we actually delete the data? Have we got to change the way that we anonymize the data? Appropriate use and access auditing, so who's actually viewed this video? And then we've got sort of regular cadence of security reviews, penetration testing, a lot of things that we would normally do in delivery with the private sector. And then, as Simon said, there's going to be constant vulnerability patches produced for any of these software platforms that we're working with. These could very much disrupt the service because we've got this kind of impetus to get them deployed so that we can make sure that our security vulnerabilities aren't exploited by anyone, but they could also have unknown impacts to our level of service. I'll just wind up with a thank you and ask you the question at the moment. If I start cropping this image, is this dangerous driving, or is this actually a qualified STIG driver carrying out a stunt? So context is key. There's got to be an element of understanding the data that we're looking at, actually still having access to the whole data at the end of the day so that we can actually make some judgments, because there's a lot of fake news out there And a lot of fake news is people engineering videos to their own devices. And there's software coming out there these days where you can kind of like stick your face on movies and pretend to be the actor and all the rest of it. So if we're in a world where people can bring the Mona Lisa to life and make her into a video, we've also just got to make sure that we look out for this in the future. And I'll hand over to Sarah. Stop sharing.
Hi there. So that's 2 class acts to follow, and I'll just get my deck shared. So my job is been variously called governance, risk and compliance, or the dark side, or the dark side's dark side, because I don't think I've ever had a job where people have been properly pleased to see me, and this would be no exception. So I have made it my life's work to try and remedy that situation, which is to face up to the fact that we're following on behind from an awful lot of enormous promise and enormous potential strategic, technical and profitable advantage. And we've got to recognise the part that we play in organisations. One of the reasons that I joined For Humanity as an organisation, as well as doing my own private consulting, is because I wanted to look at that across the piece, wider industry view, and really just following on from what these guys have been talking about. I want to kind of set out the stall, not at a level of granularity, because I've only got roughly 15 minutes, about what the governance challenge actually entails. So we have Simon's map that shows us what the strategic advantage of is. It's got a lot of meat on the bones that it illustrates that Simon has talked through in great and experienced depth. Simon's kind of presentation is the kind of presentation I sit quietly at the back of the room, sometimes with my head in my hands, sometimes feeling quite hopeful, and sometimes waiting to ask, please, can I speak to your security wonk? Because I really want to get into the meat of the bones of that. Because Simon highlighted GDPR, I'm going to want to know about all these things. I'm going to know about web security. I'm going to want to know about APIs. I'm going to want to know about platform. I'm going to want to know about the IDM plugin. I'm going to want to know about application security. I'm going to want to know about the database. I'm going to want to know about any other third parties that are involved. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus most on my most recent obsession, which is how can we equip your average firm to start to get their arms around what use of AI means. And why would we bother? I mean, what can go wrong? These breaches don't all represent ransomware or hackers. These largely represent things that are built up over time. Strategic decisions to forego governance, strategic decisions to stretch the time before compliance with requirements, or simply just scale, getting ahead of shoring up some of the foundations to bear the weight of progress and next phase development. There's a lot of technical debt that sits underneath an awful lot of these things. And there's an awful lot of failure to strategically compete between profit growth, data acquisition and some of the underpinning human rights that sit under data protection and security. But it needn't be that trade-off. What we have though is an inherent tension, because we often haven't built those foundations. So moving from a minus position to a level playing field is really quite stressful. And this specifically in our context at the moment, the first one is, might recognize it was about HireView. HireView had quite a robust audit at the time from specialists, but it covered so much of the underlying infrastructure, so much of the data processing, so much of the model operation, and perhaps didn't cover the end-to-end of what was actually happening, which raised a whole bunch of questions, which impacted a decision to halt some of the video analysis for hiring. On the other side, in the sort of accident assessment insurance kind of space, with a tipping over into policing, we have the slightly painful response to a blowing up with Lemonade Insurance, where they mentioned the over 1,000 data points they were harvesting from videos to make a decision about coverage in a few seconds. And they reversed out of that after questions being asked, out of an abundance of concern and a admittedly easy to argue variability and understanding of what was going on from the Twitterati at large. The other quote is about a paper produced by Abiba Berhain et al., cognitive science specialist who worked as an intern with Google. They analysed the 100 most quoted machine learning papers at NeurIPS and ICML, and only 2 of them mentioned adverse outcomes. So these things are being developed into proof of concept, which is a type pipeline that's only a few months these days, without really looking at adverse impacts. But if you're inside a firm and if you're trying to do the right thing, I mean, what are your challenges? Well, we have a paradox. It isn't just one instance of AI. It isn't just one change project. It isn't just one vendor. In a lot of cases, we either have whole shed loads of things, or we are in a very small firm that's needing to be nimble and needing to be agile. And the last thing they can afford is to pause and spend a lot of time. So people tell you, well, prioritize. What are your priority things to look at, or what are your priority things to kick the tires for? And you very rarely have enough time or boots on the ground. So people tell you to prioritize. You say prioritize based on what? They say based on risk. You don't know what the risk is because you haven't had time to assess, because you haven't got enough people. And around the cycle of engagement, trouble, you go. It feels like grit in what increasing the highly focused continual development machine, which is entirely reasonable. And we need to be innovating in the space of governance. And there's a lot going on in the DevSecOps space and in the automation space, which makes this easier, but most firms are not at that level of maturity. We have to be realistic about this. And security is not the first thing and data protection oversight and ethics oversight isn't the first thing you fund for as a startup when you're in your seed funding phase. And it is cradle to grave. We forget about the fact there's ongoing governance needed. Most of the time in the business models that AI operates within, there is an explicit limitation of liability after something is into production or having been sold or delivered up the supply chain. So that green ongoing governance space, the exit management space, and the due diligence spaces are all quite difficult things to do. And the inherent risk assessment for somebody at the end of a supply chain is completely different to somebody who's just acquiring the data to train a model, training a model, or tuning. And these are the things I've centered on during my career as being critical to whether we're in a position to do the right job, whether we can influence intent to maybe go a bit further in terms of overseeing these things that potentially go wrong. So there's maturity and capability. Do you actually understand what an ethic is? I mean, we're really at that level for most firms. Do we have anybody who isn't a stereotypical tech dude as a developer? No, there's absolutely, I'm not stereotyping in terms of quality judgment and value judgment, but there is a very narrow band of reference for a whole lot of the developer community that may miss things that are potential adverse outcomes that should be taken into account in a risk estimation. And in terms of residual risk, if we find stuff wrong, is it a case of JFDI? We just need to get over the line. We've got a market advantage to take. We don't have the budget for gold plating. We just want to get minimum viable product out into the wild right now. So then we work out, where are we pushing the risk in the supply chain? And it isn't just ethics. I mean, this is a really reductive set of bullet points, just so it lined up nicely on the slide. Please don't think this is all I think these things entail. But it's not all novelty in AI space. We can actually assume that things are too novel, that there is everything has an unknowable quality about risk. It really doesn't. A lot of the stuff that we've always been concerned about and needed to govern is in there: security, privacy, quality, safety. New regulations, yes, around ethics. Ethics is actually reaching some level of maturity. I'm not going to get into discussions of, is it utilitarianism or is it another form of ethics? Our challenge is making space to bring experts in to have those conversations. If we are just having a conversation about how we best define ethics and trying to bring people up to speed while everything is tearing on hell for leather, it will have gone live before we've finished producing a report. My focus is squarely on making space for conversations that need to happen. And that is about engaging as early as feasible. Killer questions. Is it a highest risk thing that we need to do right now? How much inherent risk is there? Absolute criteria, conditional criteria. Do we descope it? Do we defer it? Do we delegate it? Do we engage for all those different pillars of requirements? Before we get into the more traditional focus, just kicking the tires and then planning remediation, none of that last section, assess and manage, works unless you've got the prior ones plugging in an early enough phase of engagement. And these are the kind of things I mean by inherent risk indicators, things that it should be reasonable to know, things that you should know at an early enough phase in development to be able to stand up, plug in, integrate requirements into, whether it's waterfall development or whether it's continuous development. Some things that your project manager can have as absolute red flags to say, okay, if we're not going to sort it in the next sprint or the one after, then we really need to throw it up the chain. And from an ethics point of view, it's becoming better defined, but there are so many lenses to look through, and the places where we are lacking at the moment is access to diverse inputs from multiple stakeholders. Firms can't magic up that kind of breadth of insight. Law and regulation is changing hand over fist. KPI and KRI design for AI suffers from everything to do with risk management around AI, which is lack of tail data. And estimating residual risk of adverse outcomes, some of that fundamentally resists quantification. So it's very hard to produce metrics for those things about potential trade-offs in whether we can tolerate some risk to individuals around data protection, for instance, after delivery, looking at who is more or less vulnerable to potentially things that may go wrong, versus something like delving into the data set to analyze proportionality to your target population to properly debias. And the other aspect of this is, are we just doing a show and tell? Are we going to downstream parties who to provide some of the AI inputs through the supply chain and taking their word for it that things are compliant? Or are we actually able to do any due diligence? The orange section is the technical testing of systems, code and data. The other side is the blue section is more traditional audit focus. People can't magic up the skills and abilities in data science and engineering to do the technical testing across all of the fronts that we need to scrutinize. So if it's 70% compliance because folks said so, the degrees of compliance, as I said, level 5 might be that we were told it's compliant, it's really not. The next level up might be it is fit for purpose, we've got some evidence it exists, but nobody can show us it working. The next section might be people can show us a control working. The next section is they can show us that controls work all the time. And the final section would be you actually have an active feedback loop. So you're working on continual improvement. If you piece that together and then look at the tensions it introduces when you've got to do due diligence to understand this and to drive remediation, and understanding what portion of the risk you're managing, is it all those pillars of risk, and what it will take to fix, that's when you can start to have a management conversation, only then. So it drives in that idea of how early you need to get into this. And this is me taking a run at mapping all of the moving parts that go into that kind of engagement. Now I've left in for this version of events all of the different intersections and inputs around other elements of operational risk management, IT risk assessment, security risk assessment, privacy risk assessment. All of that hinges on some key nexus points. Around at the Genesis and custom built end is a lot of the oversight and governance for AI. Some of it is a lot more mature. We don't have enough automated monitoring. We need more. Most of the continuous change engagement for this kind of effort is quite immature. We're not really looking at post-market monitoring of models in any meaningful way that we should be. Waterfall change is more mature for engagement, but not in the AI space. And really, most of the conversations thus far have been about what could go wrong, not how we actually engage to assess how wrong it could possibly go and how do we plug in to then manage it. So I've highlighted those key nexus points, which are the places where we have shortfalls and the places where we need focus for funding, focus for engagement, doing a RACI to understand who's engaging at what point and making sure they've got time in their day to engage with us. And our challenge is specialist AI assessors and automated monitoring. Those are the places where we need to focus to bring ourselves up to speed. From one side to the next, I've taken out all the specialist AI stuff, and this is probably a more reasonable representation of where people are these days. Data subjects, if they're potentially here, aren't going to get to speak to anybody unless it's been through legal, the board and PR. And the stuff that's bubbling up is coming out of more traditional skills that might exist in the developer space, especially for smaller shops while they're developing the capabilities. The AI risk assessment therefore degrades to the point where it's what information people can rustle up, and you move back up to the place where it really should be in terms of visibility and a little bit more maturity by engaging consultants. But the global consultant inputs to this too often tend to be a plan for a plan at too high a level to operationalize. But what we can do if we do the inherent risk assessment piece that I mentioned is quite rapidly get to a point where we can have a meaningful conversation about priorities. If we have a high inherent risk, we're doing lots of stuff to lots of potentially vulnerable people with lots of sensitive data, or things that can potentially impact critical infrastructure, or things that can potentially adversely impact the environment, and we have low maturity, we shouldn't be moving forward at pace. We should be stopping until we can introduce some more maturity or fixing those gaps that have been found. If you have medium inherent risk, potentially you're looking at decisions to do with insurance. If you've got low maturity or capability, it doesn't mean that you can't move forward, but you're going to be proceeding with caution. You're going to be looking at those places where you've got hotspots of inherent risk and hotspots of uncertainty to mature and fix. Low inherent risk, low maturity, maybe you're matching somebody to clothes that they would fit in a retail space by analysing live video of them in our scenarios. If it's only a small cohort and they're not sharing sensitive data and it can't amplify and it's not driving urgent decisions about vulnerable people that will scale rapidly, you would proceed and mature in parallel. But even in those high risk scenarios, is there an ethically tolerable trade-off? If we're talking in the policing and national security space, people may well argue there is. So then you need to have some backstop, because no matter what the trade-offs are, you still need to be duly diligent. You still need to make people whole if something goes wrong. You may need to move rapidly while there is still high residual risk, either to grab market share in a way that the government has backed as a tolerable risk for innovation, or you can legally limit liability through contractuals, and there isn't regulation that demands a pause like the prohibition clauses in the EU AI Act, or you potentially insure to make sure that you'll cover your costs if something goes wrong and you can make people whole. Or you put a proportionate amount of expert prompt responsive post-market monitoring in place for complaints handling and dispute resolution. But the fact remains that if you have not done proper assurance, you wouldn't know that you are potentially going live with 64% of controls with unacceptable uncertainty. That 64% of controls combined as the amount that are non-compliant, the amount that are unknown, and the amount that are a level 3, 4, or 5 in terms of compliance, where you haven't got any assurance that they're operating over time, or they don't exist, or they're not fit for purpose. So we need to make sure that there's a mechanism to cover those bets and to have options to do so. And that's when we feed back into the strategic map. We take that view of the likely level of uncertainty we're going live with and the requirements for more resource to properly assess risk. or the trade-off to post-market monitoring, to making people whole rapidly while we backfill for some of that, and we have to be realistic about how often that actually happens, we then bring up that conversation at that kind of level back into the strategic environment. And what I wanted to really highlight with this is that we're all pulling in the same direction and trying to achieve the same thing. I'm trying to operate in the space between boards being able to influence things but not understanding. People who are at the coalface understanding things but not being able to influence. And those potentially impacted not being able to influence and not understanding. And in terms of our subject of securing our future, we need to navigate that space and create mechanisms without killing people, light touch mechanisms to do better more rapidly. And we need to make people whole with more reliability, because at the moment there's a little bit too much kicking cans down the road and waiting until the volume of concerns is loud enough, or waiting for regulation. And our future won't be lost because of the singularity. It will be lost because of the governance gaps and errors in our data that layer upon each other and lead to a really uncertain future. And that's the end for me for this. And I think we're handing now back to Jen to talk about some Q&A.
Thanks, Sarah. So thanks to all of you, actually. Thanks, Simon and Roz and Sarah. So yes, so as I mentioned in the chat, we're gonna have a Q&A. I don't know if, are we planning to do some more mapping, or are we just gonna go straight to Q&A? Okay,
I think we're going to go to Q&A, and just we can refer back to what we've got as mapping.
Perfect. Okay, let me read. I need my glasses for this one because this window is a bit small. It's funny, on Zoom you can actually zoom the chat window, but not the Q&A window. Okay, so there's a question here from Kevin, and he's saying, I think Simon has presented a consultant's view of the enabling technologies. To take VTT, it's been around for 20 years, but it's still not in daily use. Extrapolating its most common use, Alexa type devices, demonstrates a lack of appreciation of the devil in the detail. What is the likely fallout if this Curmudgeon's view happens to be true?
Shall I start with that one? So voice to text technology. Obviously, within the map, we talked about maturity. I put that one in the more mature areas compared to, and it's all relative, as any map is. So yeah, look, fundamentally, I agree with the Curmudgeon consideration. There is that. There are always people that balk at any risk, but I would argue to some degree that they're somewhat irrelevant, because actually it's to the brave go the spoils. So when you see who's framing the market, it's the ones that are actually saying we want to qualify risk as much as possible, and typically that's business risk. But absolutely, to Roz's point, in terms of reputational risk is factored into that, because that has a monetary value, and certainly public sector has a piece to that. But I think the voice to text technology is, most people don't even might not even think of it as AI. It's so ubiquitous. We've had Siri for, as you say, for a very long time, albeit far from the best. But Alexa devices and Google, etc. So much so that it's now deployed to endpoints on phones, etc. So yeah, no, I think the point that I was trying to make, and I recognise there's nuance in all of this. I set myself up as a bit of a fall guy with this, but really just to frame the conversation that's going to C-suite to sign this off. If the organizations that choose not to do this, you don't hear about, they're not making the moves. And actually, the market is driven by the innovative, but actually it was about allowing the exposure for Ross and Sarah to say, well, actually, there are these wider considerations. And actually, it's about using that map, to frame how I can contextualize it within a business case environment, but also how Ross can actually also use it, saying from an operational consideration perspective, and Sarah can talk about it from from a wider security and ethical risk perspective, talking to the same business case. Because actually my true opinion isn't just go hell for leather using all best technology and sack everybody and replace them all with robots. Actually, it's about saying drive as much efficiency as you can, but what you can do is you can't entirely disregard the possible negative outcomes. So that'd be my thoughts to that. Anybody's got anything else to add?
Okay. There's some more questions
Specifically on that.
some of you. Go ahead, Russ. Sorry.
With the voice to text piece, but I think the piece for me that is really important for this, because of things like the Alexa type devices, is trying to make sure that we've got that when you talk about sort of like diversity and inclusion, there is just such a massive audience where they've managed to actually just cope with different accents, different languages, different intonations. It is one of the areas where I think that there's so much data available that it's a lot more advanced. I'm looking at the devil in the detail. There are obviously areas where it could go horribly wrong, but all that we can actually just do is look at the benefits that we're going to get in society as a whole and just try and support those as they move forward. So I don't know if you've got anything that you want to add.
I'm always going to be most squarely focused on do we have a culture and business model that creates the time to consider these things within required timeframes, very practically, because we've all been in a situation where we're saying, well, we really don't think you should do that, and they go, well, we're gonna. You go, we don't think you should, and they go, we're gonna. And then after 5 rounds of that, it's gone live, and it's just another hole in the layers of the foundations, and that's the biggest challenge. It's starting the embedding of accountability far enough up in the tree with sufficient information to foster understanding, because I think the biggest disconnect which feeds into this is that the exec that have the ability to subtly alter the supply chain or put in a lever to call halt when you see something that's a strategic risk bubbling up is their understanding. I think at the moment in these novel technology areas, there's a feeling of debilitation amongst board members, and they're gasping for some kind of abstracted but still substantially related to the technology view of risk. And I think that's still very much missing. And we're trying to wedge reporting on potential novel technology risk into a financial risk management whole, a percentage probability and dollars impact, which doesn't actually enable you to manage it, which is where mapping bridges the gap quite effectively at these layers that you can drill down into.
Yeah, actually, if I could just add, I mean, in terms of public sector and law enforcement particularly, I think the public should be reassured in many ways. A lot of the guidance that we have is publicly disclosed. Well, obviously, a lot of conversations been around Facebook over the last couple of weeks where they just don't say or share what they're doing with the data. Whereas within policing, you've got something called MOPI, which is Management of Police Information, which are published guidelines in terms of this is how we manage it. When we're looking at voice to text, we retain the video recording as well as potentially pulling out some metadata from that dynamically, fully recognizing it's not 100% accurate. And it depends on the use case for why you're actually doing that. It might just be a subject matter request. Actually saying, well, here's a recording where your name was mentioned or something like that, so you want to pull it out for that. But equally, if it's for a murder or a counterterrorism conviction, actually you would have humans listening to that video to make sure the transcription is correct. But equally, it might be analyzing a whole bunch of video just to identify how many people call up to put in a fake police report so that they can attack police officers. That actually happens, right? So actually, it's use case specific. I think that context point that Ros was making it was very important. But actually, with the public sector, it's actually all pretty much all laid out there. except for certain circumstances around national security that's obviously kept confidential, public sector is a much more open book in terms of how it's using this technology. But it is materially different. You can check the audio recording of me talking for 60 seconds and see where it's made a couple of errors, and it's much more binary in terms of identifying its correction. But equally, as with all these things, that wider narrative, it's always evolving. I do think the voice of text is so much more mature, rather than saying, am I a liar or not? We recognize that lying tests don't work. They've been used since the 60s. But we've got AI that's kind of talking out to that, saying, oh, he's probably lying. Well, how much do we believe that? It just demonstrates, how can you prove the positive or negative on that? Yeah, it's an interesting area.
All right, so we've got some more questions here. I think we don't have long to go, but I'm sure we can extend in, because the next session in this window is 11:30 anyway. For us, in the public sector, some recent whistleblowers have highlighted prioritizing profit over safety. So the online safety bill is coming. Will this change our future?
So I mean, if I take into account the recent sort of Facebook pieces where, the whistleblowers basically identified herself, and she's talking through some of the parliamentary committees at the moment that are looking at the online safety bill. The thing about AI, and if you're looking at Facebook and all the rest of it, is you can imagine how many times, say that there's been a video where a child's been bullied, and then this has been shared multiple times across the internet. AI is one of the places where we should be able to really leverage the ability to look at those videos, screen them and say, right, okay, this isn't appropriate, stop the actual share of these piece. Facebook themselves have, they've been developing a lot of different things in the AI space for this kind of purpose, particularly after COVID. They had a lot of people who were moderators, and they were suddenly working at home, and they couldn't necessarily view a lot of the videos that Facebook wanted them to determine, was this an appropriate video to be on Facebook or not. So they've been relying a lot more on AI to do a lot of those video screening. And some of the moderators have been working in the office, some of the moderators have been working at home and sort of, paid during the coronavirus not to work and look at screens. So they've been working a lot in that sector to look at recognizing where there is another instance of that video, so that they haven't got 10 moderators looking at a video. They found the one instance, it's directed to one moderator, and then they can just say, great, okay, remove that video from Facebook. Now, when the online safety bill comes in, we are really going to need to rely on some AI and automation to be able to react fast and remove those risks. And I think that the whistleblowers will really help the legislation try and actually just make that at the forefront of a company's ethical responsibility, to say, in some cases, you've got to put the public best interest and keep people from harm, rather than focus on profit.
So when is the bill coming out, actually?
I think it's still just going through the sort of part. I know that the Facebook lady I was reading on the BBC that she was still just talking to some of the committee about it. So I'm not exactly sure, but it was in the Queen's speech, and it should be coming soon. But as with all kind of legislation, there's an awful lot that has to be considered. Sarah, you might be better.
Yeah, it's going to be a while still, I think. The question with the online safety bill, I think, isn't intent, and it isn't even squarely focused on the capabilities of the algorithms. It's the required due diligence around the online safety bill to make sure on balance it's achieving the aims is where the tie hits the tarmac in terms of people deciding what the benchmarks for harm are, and where people refer to for those things that aren't squarely and very specifically written into law. What we have surrounding the online safety bill is a lot of new legislation brewing as legislation it's dependent upon, giving Ofcom and the Secretary of State or Home Secretary ability to evolve that definition of harm and what the sanctions that would go with a positive judgment of harm would be, and where the scope spreads beyond pure illegality, to bring things into sanctionable but not illegal. Now that space makes a lot of people very jumpy because it is only as resistant to causing harm if there's an error or a misjudgment as the quality, promptness and responsiveness of your route to redress via the court system or via an appeals process. And I think there's a little bit of nervousness that you know, a lot of the routes to redress in terms of the court system and availability of legal aid and oversight functions are going in the opposite direction to being more robust and well-resourced, while we're increasing more oversight through machines that, let's face it, are not in all cases in novel areas as intelligent as we think they are. So they throw up an awful lot of exceptions. So do we have the capacity in that exception management portion of the supply chain, similar to what I spoke about in my presentation? That's my area of focus.
I mean, if I could add, I think there's a whole raft of legislation that's going to come through. And again, we can't look at one country's legislation in isolation, because obviously, again, this is a global issue. I do think this will evolve all the time and there'll be more legislation. I do think the blanket of anonymity is one of the underlying problems with social media in terms of all the hate you see on Twitter. It's from trolls that are anonymized. And actually, there should be more accountability if people are patently breaking the law and citing things, and making that much more transparent when you sign up. Freedom of speech, this isn't about saying you can't say to somebody on a one-to-one basis whatever the hell you like, but using a platform. I'm minded of the Nicki Minaj situation, where it's saying, yeah, COVID caused my friend, you know, some of my friends' persons make something to Tesco's to go, etc. And simply the reach of a pop star disseminating really dangerous information that might prevent people from taking vaccines that save their life. We've got to move that one forward, and I think actually passing some of that onus on to very wealthy technology companies is wholly appropriate. And as we've seen with some of the Facebook leaks recently, a lot of the most incorrect information drives traffic, and actually if you're just seeking profit, then you don't care about the misinformation, but there's a massive societal impact in terms of climate change deniers, etc.
It's all about trade-offs, so isn't it, Simon? Even then, it's about trade-offs. Is that you can't have the cure be worse than the illness. Nobody's arguing that the proposed cure, in terms of intent and the boundaries within which it's being considered for implementation, is worse than the illness. But you just from a perspective of my daughter has horrors that she's going to be forced to use Real ID for all her interactions with the internet, and she's going to expose all her online activities to all of her friendship groups. And that extrapolates out to the rest of her life, where she doesn't want all of her future people she wants to interact with for different reasons to see all of her online activity grouped around one ID. And she thanks to her mother, who should have given her a name like mine, Sarah Clark, which is security through obscurity, because it's that woman from 24 if you search Sarah Clark on the internet. I've given her a very unique name. But I am not minimizing, and you have been very close to the gnarly, nasty edge of child sexual abuse material proliferation and that kind of element of online safety. And there are nobody wants to be in the conversation where you're trying to stack up the value of preventing one woman from being abused because she needs to hide from her husband, versus one child who we need to desperately find because they're at risk. There isn't a sweet spot here, but we have to make sure that there's not a power imbalance between the people who are bringing the arguments on both sides.
I certainly think that the Chinese model, in terms of you have to, show your passport just to get online, is gone the extreme other end.
In Africa, a lot of countries are making you register sins, similar thing.
100%. But the minute you cross the line and you're committing a law, actual social media companies should be compelled to actually share that data, where you're breaking a law. But again, let's leave some time for other questions. But I think we're mostly in the same place. So.
Okay, there's actually a question here for Sarah. Let me just bring it up. How do you make GRC work for continuous development?
Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? It's surfacing those things which are the most inherently relevant inherent risks for the particular development at the time. There's always some front-ended effort in continuous development to stand up the requirements to then iterate around the solution for that. So it's two things going on. It's to have the capability to do that rapid inherent risk assessment, which takes into account the plans. It's surfacing the inherent risk indicators to look out for as red flags, as alerts to add into what the project manager or scrum master throws into the mix at every pause to say, have we got anything like this coming up? And having somewhere to escalate it to with somebody who has means to understand, to say, actually, you know, if you're not going to sort this in the next sprint, if it's got a high chance of ending up in production, we need to fix this. We need to pause and fix this, because most of the time developers just do not have the wherewithal or the influence to be able to pause rapid change like that. There's too much focus on just getting through and just getting done. And we're not blaming developers for being a bit fast and loose with access to get something through to the next iteration if they have no, but we would blame them if they didn't surface it's going to end up in production. So it's the tension between those two things and having somewhere to deliver the conversation into for someone who A, cares, and B, has the means to influence change.
And there's an additional question here. How do you make a business case for audit or assessment?
I mean, that's a really tough one. As I was highlighting there, you need an awful lot of warm expert bodies who you probably want to engage on getting your AI to market versus doing the governance for your AI. Although there seem to be quite a big swathe of people who've been working in AI in academia who've tipped over into the ethics space. So making the case is largely being able to visualize the pipeline, and being able to visualize the pipeline of possible requirements is about being able to rapidly understand your inherent risk, those things that can be deferred, those things that need to be done now, those things that need to be done now at depth. And then you can attach, because you have a rough idea how long it takes to kick the tires and who can do it. If you've got bodies, you can then match it to the hours in the day and the warm bodies available. You can do risk management. You can give options to flex. You know, if we haven't got the right people on board and you haven't funded me adequately to do the right kind of due diligence on this, the right kind of assessment, then, you know, you're going live with this degree of uncertainty. You need to underwrite that bet via the insurance, via being sure you've got legal liability limitation, being sure that you're not going to be paying later if you don't respond now, because it isn't the assurance function or the developer's decision to go live with outstanding risk. So you bring the potential outcomes into the foreground, as opposed to what normally happens, which is somebody rings you the day before it goes live and says, is it secure yet? So yeah, it's the front ending, that understanding of potential risk, and it's looking at it in context of the trade-offs in terms of the benefit and the business case, and putting the two things together. It's cost benefit analysis. It's what the business has been always hoping for from security. It's enabling rapid enough early assessment to gift them that.
Okay, thanks for that, Sarah. I've got a question here for Simon, actually. What is the consideration of false positives and the impact in the decision making of whether to use AI, that is on, say, suicide prevention or making an arrest from a wanted list?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So I think I think this is about the context-specific nature of things. And look, AI is used on CCTV cameras to be able to red flag if somebody jumps off a bridge. Okay, so we can dispatch our NLI to save their life. That's a really healthy use of AI. And a false positive is you check the camera, see if it was a coat thrown over rather than a person. I don't know how many people throw their coats, but you know what I mean. And clearly a false positive, you double check. Actually, that's really quite compelling. But clearly, there was a case of a live facial recognition test done in London, where there was a lot of pushback, and I won't go into too much detail. People know about it; they can look it up. Where the actual consequence of actually a false positive, and look, there was a technology piece, and then the police officer was reviewing that, and then somebody's collar would be felt, and they would be questioned by a police officer saying, "I think you're wanted," and actually the accuracy was immature. So consequently, the false positive hit on that was someone just having a shopping day in London with their family, and then being kind of quite grievously interrupted by the police. You can understand, I hope, the sentiment behind it in terms of if you thought this is a wanted serious criminal, but equally that false positive. I think it's a really important part, and I think that actually links to the earlier question in terms of that cost benefit analysis. Sometimes that cost is actually reputational, and actually policing took a hit on that reputational piece in terms of that technology was really not mature, but that's why it was a test. Maybe some of the wider consideration could have been learned from. And what I can absolutely reassure people is it absolutely has, both specifically and holistically. In every technology program that I've been involved with, and I've connected into a lot, ethics is a very ethical consideration of an application of technology within law enforcement is in every board, and actually widely adopted by senior practitioners as an important piece. However, I would say it's more of an art than a science, in as much as there are so many ethics teams, boards, etc., and methodologies around that. They can look at the same problem, come up with a completely opposing answer. And that's that classic kind of yes minister piece in terms of if you want to get, doing a survey, well, what answer do you want to get? And then we'll write the questions. I think there's a piece in terms of the maturing of the ethics process. So I think we're there in terms of recognizing it has a role, but that links into the wider piece. What is that cost? Which ones do we identify that we assess? Because we can be blindsided.
Okay. So we don't have a lot of time, but got two questions here. Actually, and I think there's another one for Sarah. Let me just read this too. I think these are kind of related. It is incredibly hard, and this is from Matthew Adams. It is incredibly hard to develop capability of the delivery team level, where there are not already islands of expertise in the map that allow teams to develop the skills and experience they need from the inside out. What approaches might we take to seeding those skills, specifically to the risk point? And I think this next question is kind of related as well. Can you talk a little bit about the digital competency or lack thereof of many leaders and the risk this may present? Who wants to?
I'll start with the building competency within the teams. Yeah, I feel that pain entirely, and I very much see my job as kind of high-level operational / strategic around governance in these areas as being that translation. It's doing an upfront assessment of where demarcation starts and ends for who's accountable for surfacing these things in a timely manner, and therefore needing the knowledge to do so, needing the time to do so, needing the escalation routes to be able to do so, is starts entirely with doing this racing, working out who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed from the technical teams through governance teams up to the executive and people like legal, procurement, IT service partners, working out where the remit starts and ends, and actually making a closely documented case about the constraints, assumptions, dependencies, risks and issues as well. That we're just about to pay half of our specialist team in this, or we've got a sales push that means that nobody's going to be able to surface for 3 months, or that we've got a high profile deliverable and every dev resource is going to be on this, so no one's going to want to talk to you. If you understand that stuff up front, you can frame that awareness, knowledge and engagement piece as a risk of its own that is not, again, it's not owned in the governance space and it's not owned in the dev space, it's owned in the executive space. That if you are requiring change to move at pace without the capability to produce effective oversight, that is a decision and it's a risk to manage, and it's an executive risk to manage. And that can drive in, if you actually have a piece of paper you want a wet signature on with that on it, it can sometimes produce the resource for training. and for a pause for thought. And that's a constructive mechanism of risk management, but you do need somebody who can navigate all of those areas with sufficient influence to tie those messages together.
If I could add very briefly, I led a piece of work around technology and data standards across policing, and one of the things I did was kind of revisit the terms of reference of that, and also the governance structure, and absolutely to Sarah's point in terms of the rating, particularly the responsible consulted. The consulted brought in an expert practitioner layer, and again, this talks to the whether it be security patching or service improvement. When you're looking at service functions, they're continually evolving. Ultimately, does it meet the core mission? So if it needed expert knowledge, that was delegated out to the expert panel that says we've gone to version 6.6, 6.7, 6.8, and ultimately it's still consistent with the core piece. If it now allows a new a new feature that can be explained in plain language to the responsible owner, who's not a technologist, who's obviously much more senior organizationally, but can say, well, now we can do this thing, which is a whole, in addition to what was previously done. To use the example, using voice to text, but now we can identify if it's honest. Well, that's not just it's better quality of voice to text, it's now we're going to put in a new metric that says, would it be good to say if we think this person's lying based on 50% accuracy? That's actually not a practitioner role, that's a senior responsible owner kind of level conversation. But you don't need to be technical to talk about that ethical question in the wider piece. But I do think it's a really important part in terms of the evolving weight of these consulted, actually having expert practitioners in the loop. And having that kind of due diligence is imperative.
Okay, we're getting reminders here from our host in the background. So interesting questions. Okay, I think we're gonna have to wrap up. Thanks very much again, Simon, Roz, and Sarah for joining us today. They will be in the networking halls, if I'm not mistaken. So hope we'll see you there, the three of you, and for our audience, so try and catch them there. But we're going to be wrapping up this session now, and the next session in this window will be at 11:30, and it's going to be about the topic of does awareness matter. So join us back then at 11:30, and see you at the networking lounge. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rob.